Meditations with Ryan Slomak.
Hello and welcome to episode 41 of Meditations. I'm your host Ryan Slomak, and this is a show dedicated to making space for conversation with interesting people just to see what we can learn from one another. On today's show, I am over the moon to have the Golden Voice of Audiobooks, the one, the only Stefan Rudnicki. Stefan is somebody who's been on my radar for quite literally decades, as he's read me hundreds of stories, everything from Bartleby the Scrivener to Ender's Game, and I have always kind of found his career interesting, and it was just over the moon to be able to connect. If you're unfamiliar with Stefan, Stefan owns the company Steamboat Media and has been producing thousands of audiobooks as the role of performer, producer, and director, having worked for Dove Audio for a little while to kind of get his feet wet in the audiobook world, to eventually creating his own company and becoming kind of a mentor and a coach for the audiobook world. He's somebody that is regularly hired by other audiobook facilities to produce content that maybe they can't do in-house. And he's also a regular for authors who know that they're going to get consistent products. We'll talk a little bit about why they've got such good quality control on this episode. So without further ado, let's hear from the Golden Voice of Audiobooks. Here is Stefan Rudnicki. Stefan Rudnicki, thank you for bringing your voice to the show. I'm always really fascinated with the way in which sort of our youth has, or our youth experiences have sort of influenced us. And you started off very worldly, having been born in Poland and then eventually making your way to New York City. Tell us a little bit about your sort of childhood, like how I have little details, but how long were you in Poland, and eventually when did you guys make your way to the U.S.?
I was in Poland only for a year and a half. My father at that point was a draft dodger from the Russian army. So my parents walked across Poland, or a lot of it, from Warsaw. I was actually born in Krakow, but they walked from Warsaw, where they lived at that point, to what is called Gdańsk, managed to catch a ship to Sweden, walked with a baby carriage, right? Pretending to be locals. Got to Malmö, from there by train to Stockholm, and they got a sort of apartment to live in a large house owned by a German family in Saltsjöbaden, which is a seaside suburb of Stockholm. We were there for, the calculations are a little weird, but somewhere in the neighborhood of 3.5 to 4.5 years, at which point my father managed to get a visa to get to the States. No, sorry, a visa to get to Canada. He was looking for a visa to get to the States. He had family here, but it didn't matter. This was fairly soon after World War II, and the United States were not taking a lot of immigrants at that point. So he had applied for visas to, oh, good grief, Brazil, Cuba, Argentina, Canada, and the US. And the one to Canada came through first, after a considerable wait. And that's where I actually started first grade.
In Canada?
In Canada, in a school that was bilingual, English-French, and I spoke neither of those. I spoke a little German. I spoke Polish. Okay. And I spoke Swedish. Those languages are still in there. I visited Krakow, this is about 8-9 years ago, for the first time since I was a baby. And I could read the signs pretty well. And from reading the signs to myself, I knew how to pronounce them. Once I knew how to pronounce it, I knew what it meant. So it's kind of a two-stage process, but it's all in their language. And that's been a very important part of my life all along. I picked up Latin, French, a smattering of Spanish, a few other languages. I visited Rome for the second time about 15 years ago. For a while before the pandemic, I was in Rome or some portion of Italia every year or two, and I picked up a lot of Italian. I also used to sing opera, so I knew a little bit of Italian from there as well. Notte giorno, things like that.
Fascinating. I mean, so you and I had talked about your book Fantastic Imaginings prior to this interview, and in that book, Harlan Ellison writes you an introduction. We'll talk about him later, but he specifically references the sheer number of languages that you spoke, and it's just really interesting that like that ended up being that sort of skill that you picked up just via the travel of your family became such a bedrock of your career. That's fascinating. How long were you guys in Canada before eventually making it to the States?
About a year and a half. Uh, my father's uncle managed to get a visa for us from Montreal, which is where we were, to New York City, and that's where I really grew up. Lived in Queens for a while. My first grade was in four different schools. I started in a school in Canada. Then they moved all the people from that little school, like a month in, to a bigger school. And then we left to go to New York, and I was sent to a boarding school where I caught every disease imaginable because I hadn't been around other kids mostly. Was in the infirmary for the entire like 2 winter months that I was there. And then my parents had moved to Queens. That's where I finished first grade and did schooling until college.
Well, if the secret to making great art is suffering and trauma, I feel like you learned that pretty early.
Well, yeah, yeah. It was a bear of a time to grow up in, and my parents were hardly secure in their languages and culture. Yeah, it was a process.
Well, so making it to New York, obviously like going into performance and theater, you're in the right town for it. And I'm kind of curious about like at what point in your own sort of developmental cycle did you start to realize that like performance was a part of your personality or a type of art that you wanted to create?
I'd say high school. Well, maybe earlier, but it's hard to document that. It's hard to really find the sources. But it was in high school that I had a terrific music teacher, uh, Mrs. Gullibin. She was dressed like a gypsy, and she had these glasses, and she would look out at the class. And first day, and she'd say, "That's Gullibin, not the other word," right? She was great, and I started singing a lot through her choirs and so forth. And I met a lot of people. I sang with the All City Choir in New York, which was an amazing experience. 250 voices from all five boroughs. After rehearsals, and we actually performed at Carnegie Hall. But after rehearsals, we'd break up into groups, sometimes groups as big as 100, or in other cases, four or five that were kids from my school. And we'd walk the city singing. In fact, uh, that's how I got used to celebrities because New York is kind of like that. You can run into anybody on the street, or you could back then. I'm not sure that's the case anymore. But I remember we had a rehearsal at Carnegie Hall, a group of about five of us from my school. We're just singing harmony on a couple of pieces that we knew. And there were these two girls, women, I don't know what to call them exactly, uh, who were following us and listening. And I said, holy mackerel, I recognized Joan Baez as one of them. It turns out it was her and her sister, Mimi, later Farina, who had also been at Carnegie Hall prepping for her first big concert there. And she heard us singing, and well, I went back and introduced us and said, "Oh, yeah, I'm such a fan of yours," and I really was. I still am. I was listening to some of her music last night, but she said, "Could you do us a favor?" We said, "Sure." She said, "I'm planning to do the Battle Hymn of the Republic in my concert, and I'd like to get the audience to join in. So could you sing it, and could I sing it with you so I get a sense of how the harmonies work?" I said, "Yeah." And we did. And we walked down 57th Street, going east. We actually stopped at the corner of 57th and Fifth Avenue and sang the Battle Hymn of the Republic until a guard from Tiffany and Company came out and chased us away. Yeah, singing was the thing. I did a couple of summer programs at the University of Vermont while I was in high school, which involved some more dramatic stuff, not necessarily singing or singing with added performance values, like a little short opera by Kurt Weill, Down in the Valley. I played the villain in that. So when I got to college, I started getting involved in the theater crowd. And there was a Gilbert and Sullivan Society across the street at Barnard. There was the Columbia Players. And very quickly, by my second semester, I was doing 3, 4, 5 shows a year acting, and eventually some directing.
Can I interject real quick? I mean, obviously, I just want to go back to your family dynamic real quick, just in the sense that, like clearly your parents had some very specific goals in mind, moving, all across Europe to be able to make their way to to the U.S. and provide you with a substantial amount of opportunity. I guess what I was curious about is like well, just real quick, how did they make their living once they made it to the U.S. And in order to support you? And then how did they feel about your aspirations toward theater and performance?
They were okay with the aspirations. My mother would be considered the creative one. She started sewing while in Sweden, sort of making dresses, making shawls, whatever. And when she got to New York, she went to was it the Parsons School of Design, I think. She took a course there and got a terrific job as the head designer of a company called Party Formals that made dresses that were sold throughout all of the major department stores. And she also drew. She did some painting. My father somehow, starting in Canada, got a job as an optician. He didn't have any background there. I think he may have started pre-med or something like that when he was in Poland. That was never quite clear. In New York, he quickly became not an optometrist, nothing like that, but an optician, someone who knows lenses. And he became the chief salesperson for this New York-based company. And he would travel like a traveling salesman, selling frames and such. Well, I guess he did pretty darn well at that. So,
Oh man, it is the perfect confluence of amazing factors to build this bedrock of your career. I am fascinated, Stefan.
yeah. all of the performance experience in college was kind of critical because I realized that performance of some kind was going to be important for me. And I was tending towards directing. I directed the varsity show in my senior year. By that time, I was the general manager of the Columbia Players. I ran the student organization. I had been a business manager already for 2 years for that organization. So I was active in the mechanics of getting something to run. That also meant I had access to the various stages, including backstage during concerts. I remember being backstage watching Odetta perform from behind. I was, wow, just incredible, just incredible. But yeah, it was a great experience, and there were a lot. There was a strong theater/literary community. I also worked for the literary magazine there for a while. I wrote some stuff for them, mostly editorial though. Columbia at that point, and I think still, depended very much on their core curriculum, which involved at that point at least 4 semesters each of contemporary civilization and humanities. These were difficult courses. They were general to some degree, but they involved history a great deal, read from the original manuscripts, translated, of course, in many instances, but it was an incredible education. So I got the habit of reading all the time. We had weekly assignments in some of these classes of upwards of 500, 600, 700 pages for a week. And we had to read it. We had to learn how to read quickly, how to absorb. So that was another factor. My mentor, my senior year in college, was Robert Brustein, who just passed away within the last year. We didn't know at the time, but he was on his way to becoming dean of the Yale School of Drama. I was taking his senior seminar, and I applied to the School of Drama. He took me aside one day, and he said, "I'm going to accept you, but you have to know that a major factor is that you're such a good actor." I was going into the directing program. It was going to be run and was run like a conservatory, so that none of the first-year actors were allowed to perform. But he needed to keep a performance program going to bring the subscribers in and the audiences. So he figured I would be a mainstay actor, as an actor there, while I took the directing courses, because I wasn't in the acting program. I could act all I wanted.
It's a nice backdoor policy into Yale there, my friend.
And that was an amazing time. Brustein had just amazing contacts with, how to put it, the most experimental wings as well as the most traditional. So we'd have Kenneth Haig performing Pirandello. We'd have Stacy Keach, who was a recent graduate at that point, come in and do, well, what did he come in to do? Coriolanus, I think. Jonathan Miller would come in and direct productions. And at the same time, we had the Living Theater, which was the most, I guess, the most advanced kind of experimental theater that you can imagine. Going out and taking over the street during a performance, stuff of that kind. Just some amazing people. No, I was in the 3-year program, and I ended up with a directing degree. And somehow that led me, rather than directly into theater as a pro, it led me to teaching.
Yeah, and I was reading that you taught at Columbia and Yale, and throughout your career you've been to Dartmouth University or Rochester, Long Island University. What,
Mhm.
how did you feel about that transition, knowing that you would continue to be in front of students as opposed to in front of traditional audiences?
Because I was a director, and in most cases, a director of a program. I was either a department chair or in my first teaching gig, which was the University of Rochester, there was no theater department, but there was a student organization and a kind of theater program that I stitched together from a few existing performing arts related courses involving dance and so forth, and some stuff that I taught, and some adjunct faculty whom I was able to bring in. The transition for me made a lot of sense because, how to put it, I was not doing the art for a watered down kind of student mentality. A My idea was that when students were performing, their work should be as good or better than what you'd see on Broadway or off Broadway or in the local regional theaters. It should be better um, because they had more energy, more power to change the world. We were talking about late 60s, 70s here. This was the time when change was possible, and let's make it happen through the best theater possible. So the kinds of productions that I did were very often experimental. Um, Very often they involved some major people. They Once I got started teaching at this level, I used professional guest actors who would be also teachers. I negotiated the actor-teacher contract with Actors Equity back then, which had not existed before. I don't know if it still does, but it was a milestone at that point because I could actually hire experienced pros to work with the students at a reasonable rate, which was which was just wonderful. And that is the level. I mean, let's see. Some of the things, I mean, one of the things that I did at Long Island University was premiered a a score by Darius Milhaud for Bertolt Brecht's Mother Courage. It had never been done before, or at least outside of a concert version, maybe in Germany or France. But I managed to get a copy of the full orchestral score because I was introduced by a professor of mine from Columbia, Eric Bentley, whom I stayed in touch with. He put me in touch with Milhaud's widow, and I ended up with this orchestration. So, what am I going to do? I'm going to do a production of Mother Courage with a score by a major French opera writer. And it was wild. It was absolutely wild. Why not? You know, let's do things at that level.
Yeah, I feel like there's something to be said too about the fact that like let's both acknowledge that like you were pretty young when you stepped into the higher ed education space, right? Like I'm viewed as a young professor at the age of 38 now, and you're in your what, late 20s?
When I started teaching at the University of Rochester, I was 24.
Okay. Your early 20s, we'll even call it. But
Yeah.
I think there's something to be said about getting into a professional space, whatever you want to call it, and just not like being able to confidently know what would be good for you as a student and be able to think through the systems in a way that maybe other people haven't. And I just love thinking about what the Stefan Rudnicki classroom experience must be, because you're in these places where you're fresh out of school, you've been studying how to direct theater at this very high level, and now the term directing is playing not only on as to what's happening on the stage, but how do we use the systems and the mechanisms that are available to us to change things. I mean, that must have been just a totally electric experience for those students.
I gather it was. I'm still in touch with fairly large numbers of them, some going back as far as the University of Rochester, more from Long Island University, some from NYU, where I taught part-time for a couple of years. They're all on Facebook. Some of them are on some of the other social media channels, and they're there. They're still there. My birthday was recently, and I got wishes from people I remember as students. One of those just wrote her first book. This was somebody from Long Island. She wrote a book about it's like a new definition of public speaking, how to do it correctly. And she goes around lecturing on that, right? What fun.
That's so cool. Well, I feel like I could ask you questions about your educational career and your theater experience for another 3 hours, but let's move ahead a little bit. I'm very, tell me about the sort of step away from academia into deciding that performance was going to be your livelihood.
It didn't start as performance, especially. It started geographically because I was feeling in New York City, I was feeling the verticality of it. It felt like everything was above me, bringing me down. That's what it felt like psychologically. And I didn't like that. I needed some wide open spaces. I had come to LA for the first time as part of a workshop that was co-sponsored by the AFI and the DGA. It was for teachers specifically. I realized what an opportunity film might have for me. And then back in New York, I took a summer course at NYU in filmmaking, a practicum, and I learned a lot about that. So I said, I got to do some films. I got to do that. And what I did at one point is I packed up my little Honda and drove to LA. That was the start of it. I got some work teaching acting through a management company that one of my former students was part of. I wrote and directed my first feature, my only one that I wrote and directed. I directed a second feature, but not much to be said about those. They were not very good, but they allowed me to also learn about fully the mechanics of how motion pictures work. Consequently, when things were feeling a bit lean, what I could do is get work as a first AD, first assistant director. Mostly low budget pictures, nothing major, nothing special. But again, the mechanics of it plus the art was the combination. And I kept active with certain playwrights. And at a certain point, I was planning to do a show with a particular playwright, and she said she was about to receive an award, I think through South Coast Rep here. She needed to rewrite a play of hers that they were going to do there. She said she probably wouldn't have time to do the abridgment that she'd been hired to do. And I said, whoa, 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 what's an abridgment? What are you talking about? And she explained that she was doing part-time work for this company called Dove Audio, and she was abridging books. I said, hell, I've abridged Shakespeare. I can abridge anything you want. And I got an interview the following week with the production coordinator there. I got my first abridgment gig. She handed me a book and said, "Here, abridge it." In those days, this is before you're being given files that you edit. You got to type it all out. But I did the first one. I had a 2-week deadline. Not a problem. In those days, a typical audiobook was 3 hours, 2 cassettes. That's it. I did a couple of abridgments. They seemed to like it. And when they fired a different production coordinator, someone else who would come in, because they didn't appear at their 7:30 a.m. production meeting, I got offered the job of production coordinator. Within 6 months, I was vice president of the company, and I was basically in charge of producing stuff. I was not performing. I mean, I'd sometimes read the titles, I'd sometimes read a short story as part of a collection, but I was producing and directing. Until a few years later, I started that in 94. By 96, 97, I was taking a shot at, why don't I narrate this book? A favorite detective writer of mine, and there was an edition of a book of his that had been done by a family member, and it wasn't very good. The author wanted a new one, and I said, let me try that. It'll be cheaper. And that was fun. And I did a couple of other things. I wrote some stuff there, like, well, put together the Valentine book that you saw. I wrote a couple of other things there too, including a novelization of Stephen Fry's movie about Oscar Wilde, which was pretty amazing, working with dailies. Again, I was not a performer. When I became a performer was when Dove Audio folded for reasons having nothing to do with the audio division, which was doing very well. I was at that point the publisher, but there were other investments and other issues. The company changed hands in terms of ownership. Pretty soon, I found that my company, Skyboat, became, well, we ended up doing everything. We were working for a while with a company called Audio Literature, which specialized in kind of spiritual material and some classics. And then started working with all these other companies, which eventually turned out to be HarperCollins, Simon & Schuster, Penguin Random House, their current names, Macmillan, also working with Blackstone, which is a major force and has been for a number of years. Suddenly, I found that I had a following as a narrator, and I loved it.
Yeah, and you're so good at it, Stefan. Let's fill in a couple of blanks if you don't mind. One is when you were doing abridgments, kind of taking a book and making sure that it's now going to be ready for 3 hours worth of material or whatever. What type of books were you being given? I mean, were these self-help? Were these mysteries? Were these pulp novels? Was it everything? Like, what were you doing?
Everything from, I think we were abridging Dickens for Paul Scofield to read because he didn't want to read the full book, right? We were doing one of the James Bond books. I mean, you name it.
Okay, cool. And then your company Skyboat Media, it says listed as 1979 on your LinkedIn profile, but what year did that start, and what was the purpose of that company originally?
The real name of the company from its beginning is Skyboat Road Company. Okay, Skyboat Road. Well, it started as a theatrical road company. I got a company together back in 1979, took them to the Edinburgh Festival, and we did 5 different shows in rep there. It was a small company. There were about 9 or 10 people, and including a choreographer and so on and so forth. And we did these shows there and got a nice award. So it was a road company. Skyboat Road was nice because the three founders of the company had three different astrological symbols as their birth dates, representing the sky, earth, and water. So, so that's the origin of Skyboat Road Company. Later changed to Skyboat Media as the because we were doing all kinds of things. We've done short films. We've done just about everything there is to do.
Publishing, putting on events, everything in between, right? So, in regards to, Skyboat Media, you guys start to kind of, if I understand, kind of become almost like I don't know, a creative house for companies that want to create audio content. They want to do audiobooks. They know that you guys are some of the best in the business, so they come to you. Is that a fair assumption?
Yes, it is. We have some strong relationships with several small publishers, a couple of big ones who have sent us work on a consistent basis, and also a lot of individual writers. I started in 2013 actually collecting audio rights to some of my favorite books. So, some of them genre work, thrillers and sci-fi and fantasy, horror, going back to what I was reading when I was a teen and then revisiting it and recording and publishing them. Authors like Frederick Brown, for example. Yeah, Frederick Brown, Charles Beaumont is another one who wrote, feels like he wrote the stories that were the basis for half of the Twilight Zone episodes.
He was,
Right.
we're on this show, if people don't know it, actually behind me, Stefan, is literally a collection of Rod Serling books because I just did a presentation about him a few weeks ago. But for those who don't know, Charles Beaumont, Richard Matheson, and Rod Serling were the three head writers of the Twilight Zone. And unfortunately, Beaumont had a very brief stay on this planet, but produced an amazing amount of work as teleplays, novels, and short stories. So to know that they're in your hands is just an amazing gift to the sci-fi community.
It is great. It is absolutely great. Yeah, so I started that way, and then other living authors got wind of it. Harlan, I knew because through the connection at Dove, because of his performance qualities. I hired him to come in and record a book now and then. What was it? I forget the first one. I think it was a Jules Verne. It was something like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. It was just great fun, and he'd come in his bathrobe, which was his thing at that time, and he'd record a book, and he was brilliant.
Well, I want to stay on Harlan for a second. For people who may be unfamiliar with Harlan Ellison, I just want to paint a little bit of a picture. He's a very colorful character in the world of speculative fiction. Wrote famously City on the Edge of Forever, a Star Trek episode that they greatly edited that has now been adapted into comic books. It's been adapted into a multi narration project that you did. He wrote two amazing stories, Repent Harlequin, said the TikTok Man, and I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, that I'm hoping we get to talk about a little today. But also, on top of being a writer with a vocabulary that might actually triumph Mr. Stefan Rudnicki's here, he was also a very, very colorful character, lived in a funky house called the Aztec Temple of the Future, I believe was the name of it, and was known as if he was friends with you, if he was friendly, you'd have wonderful relations. But if you managed to irk him even slightly, you were either written off his pages for the rest of his life, or he would make your life a living terror. So, Stefan, the fact that you guys managed to hit it off truly created some of the greatest audio media, period. But also, I'm sure just led to some really funky stories about Harlan.
Yes, most of which I would not go into. One of the thrills, there was a radio producer, Midwest, I think from Chicago initially. Yuri Rozovsky was a terrific producer of radio drama. And he put something together called 2000X. In fact, I've got a poster of it there, which was a collection of stories that took place beyond the year 2000. This, of course, was produced for NPR in 1998 and 99, with a sense of the growing future. And I ended up, because I wanted to have these things exist in perpetuity, not just in some radio archive. So I became executive producer of the audio edition, if you will, and in fact of the NPR thing. Yeah, I think it says that I am right there. Yes, it says I'm executive producer, so I must have been. The story Repent Harlequin starred Robin Williams and me. And working with that man, with Harlan right there, essentially directing, right? Oh man, what an experience. What an experience.
Well, let me paint a little bit more, if you don't mind. For people who are unfamiliar with Repent Harlequins of the TikTok Man, Harlan Ellison used to always pride himself on the fact that it was one of the most reprinted stories in the English language. And I've taught it in my classes. It's a phenomenal piece of work. And for people who are looking for a story that you can experience in a manner that might just sort of wash over you and fill you with joy, it's a great example. And if you want something that you can really dig into and just look at every Easter egg of a reference within it. It accomplishes both of those things. But it's the story about a society where there's a master timekeeper where every second is accounted for every person on the planet, essentially. And a Harlequin, an individual, has been going out of his way to disrupt the cycles and hopefully make people aware that living by the clock is not necessarily the way you need to exist in this world. And there's a whole lot of beautiful subtext there. Having Robin Williams be the Harlequin, the master of shenanigans, must have been just an absolutely baffling experience, especially when you, Stefan, are the one who is supposed to be remaining composure. You are the rock-like individual of the master timekeeper. I can't even imagine what that looked like in the recording studio.
Yeah, it was pretty amazing. I had actually briefly met Robin back in New York when I was doing some extra work on a film, the name of which now escapes me.
Was it Awakenings?
Yes, yes, thank you. That's exactly what it was. And uh, I was in a sort of a classroom scene that was shot at Columbia, at one of the classrooms where I used to go. And I was sitting there, and there, up on stage, is Robin Williams, and who else was in that?
Robert De Niro.
Robert De Niro was constantly sort of kibitzing, right? And so that was a fun experience. And then face to face to work with Robin a few years later was just a trip. Yeah.
Well, if you don't mind just staying in this territory a little bit longer, I'm curious about one of the things that we'll hopefully get to is the sort of change of technology in the narrative process. But I'm curious about, let's use 2000X as an example in the Repent Harlequin sort of multi-narrational experience. How do you guys go about facilitating that type of project? I mean, like is Robin Williams stepping in and this is a dry run? Is there practice that you guys are doing ahead of time? Are you renting a recording studio, or is this a recording studio that you guys own at this time? Like, can you shed some light into the sort of background mechanisms that would make a project like that come to fruition?
Well, things have changed a great deal, partly because of the pandemic. We used to have four working studios in our own facility, and we could have four things going on at the same time. We could also cross-record from one studio to another. We can actually do that still here now. It meant that we could bring in a, let's say, a cast of 10 and record a fully dramatized piece. We did that. I mentioned Eric Bentley as a professor whom I knew from Columbia. He wrote and compiled a book called 30 Years of Treason. And it is a history of the House Un-American Activities trials with a lot of original actual transcripts involved. And in 3 volumes, we put together his entire book, recording in one of our studios with people coming in, playing the different characters who were interviewed, playing the different senators or whatever who were involved. A great project. Well, come the pandemic and come before that, fortunately, in some respects, the tendency to have actors do all their own work to save money. Something called punch and roll system, where instead of a straight record where somebody comes in and edits it, the actor edits their own work. That became the norm just about a decade ago, maybe a little less. What that did was allowed or encouraged actors who wanted careers in audiobooks to build or buy or create their own studios. So what we were able to do during the pandemic years was we did, in fact, do several dramatized pieces where we had narrators in 3 or 4 different time zones, recording at their own studios. We have a post team that would check these studios and make sure that with a little bit of tweaking, they could sound like they were in the same room. And in some cases, it didn't matter because they weren't in the same room anyway, not even in the story. But yeah, we developed a way of doing that. Gabrielle or myself would be the director, and we'd also be performing with all these other people.
That's really cool. And with as I was sort of reading about things, you just talked, was it Eric Bentley was the writer you just referenced, or the professor? And then also you guys did Ender's Game as sort of like these pieces that were kind of like game-changing, multi-narrational projects.
Ender's Game, actually, it wasn't Ender's Game initially, but the Ender series by Orson Scott Card was key to a shift that we did pioneer, together with the books of Ben Bova. Both were, in Scott's case, still is a close friend. Ben Bova was until he passed away a few years ago. Both of these writers wrote, and in Scott's case, still writes, with multiple POVs much of the time. And the style and tone of the writing changes as the POV changes. Multiple narration audiobooks were very rare until around the turn of the millennium. You'd occasionally get something where, let's say, the first person serial killer would have their chapters in the book, and that would be a different reader from the main narrator, right? Or an epistolary novel where it's all letters going back and forth, right? Where you have two people and they correspond and each one reads their own letters. Or if the POVs are first person, then you might have a couple of people reading. But the idea of having multiple narrators in third person narrative really wasn't done. We began doing that with both Ben's work and with Scott's. We got some letters early on saying, whoa, the narrator changes here. Why is that? Right? Within 2 years, everybody was doing it. It's now the norm where you have distinctive writing by multiple POVs. In some cases, more than you really need. That was first done as a regular thing by us. And I'm very proud of that.
It's a phenomenal work. I mean, I had read Ender's Game when I was in high school, and then I had you know, I had kind of forgotten about it, and then I remember, I think I told you this in the email, picking up a cassette of it and driving to grad school classes and being like, I'll listen to this. And it is an immersive novel. And then all of a sudden to add these multiple perspectives that are elevated by just phenomenal audio performances, I think just gives you it's like all of a sudden I've gotten a new pair of glasses and I'm able to see the narrative even clearer than I had before. Like I think it just really elevates that story in a phenomenal way. How did you guys, so at that time, did you guys have multiple studios within your facility? Like how was this recorded?
No, no. We were bringing people in individually initially. We had access to a studio where we could do two narrators at the same time. So we could do a little bit of dialogue, but mainly it was piece by piece and then sew them together. Yeah.
Awesome. And I'm sure that did you direct that project?
Yeah.
Well, what I was going to say is that I'm sure it seems like the perfect project to dovetail with your previous experience with abridgment, because it's not about synthesizing something down. It's about okay, now that I'm allowed to have all the elements, here's how I can synthesize them into production days and things like that, which is kind of abnormal for audiobook production.
Well, I've always felt that creativity comes from taking a long, hard look at what are the materials you have to work with. And that's why when I was doing theater work, I loved found spaces rather than working in an existing working theater. I preferred to use a university common room, an outdoor setting, a basement, an attic. These are all places where I staged performances in different ways. And that was the creative thing. I had a lighting designer whom I was working with at the time um, for quite a while, in fact, who kept coming in to do guest gigs for me because he loved doing this and to find the possibilities of special lighting. And the same thing is true for audiobooks. What is it about this specific book, whatever it is, whatever genre, it doesn't matter. What is it about this book that is unique? Not that is like these other five books. What is unique? What is it that demands a particular approach that I don't know what that's going to be yet? But I got to look at it very, very carefully and see what's going to suit. And that's the beginning of the process.
And like thank you, and let's lean into that a little bit more. I mean, it was just some little statistics is that like you've narrated over 1,000 audiobooks and been involved with over the production of like I think over 3,000, which those are a lot of zeros at the end,
It,
my friend.
it, it's actually narrated about, yeah, no, yeah, that's pretty good. The production And publishing is actually more into the neighborhood of 5 or 6 thousand.
Let's just keep bumping you up there, Stefan. I mean, 5,000 productions. That's a lot of stuff. That's a lot of words. That's a lot of things going on. And, oftentimes people become known for, this is the individual who narrates all the self-help books, or, what is it? Is it Michael Beck like narrates like all John Grisham's books? Like there's these people that become their bread and butter becomes a very specific angle. And you've done a lot of fantasy, science fiction, horror, which is great. But it was fun going through your listing and seeing like, okay, he's done self-help books, he's done erotica, he's done history novels, he's done business books, and I'm curious about the nuances in your preparation and your performance that you find yourself kind of considering when you take on a new project, specifically to narrate. How do you change things up?
Well, it depends on whether I know the author's work and I have a sense of where they're coming from. If it's a brand new author or someone who's new to me in this audiobook context, then I look for certain clues and cues. What's the structure? I start with the structure. Where does this story, because everything is a story, even if it's a self-help book, it's got an arc of some kind. Where's it start? Where's it end? What are the stages in between? I don't think a lot of narrators really pay attention to that. They go for the detail, what are these characters like? I start with that structure. I start with linguistic variety or linguistic tone. Where does this person come from culturally, language-wise, psychologically? What languages do they speak? What kinds of expression are they comfortable with? Okay, that's a consideration. And only then, if it seems appropriate, do I get into character work. Who are these people? Because by then you kind of have it. Yeah, so that's kind of the process. I try not to read the book in advance. If I read it years and years ago, that's fine. But I don't believe in rehearsal in the sense of practicing it, because I want to make discoveries as I read so that the listener can hear my discoveries. I want to be surprised when, whoa, that just happened, right? So that's different from a lot of other narrators.
I love there's something to be said about like understanding the gargantuan nature of something like a novel, right? Like, it's you're dealing with 200 pages or 400 pages or 1,000 pages. I mean, that's a lot to contend with, and allowing yourself to have almost a simplified checklist of concerns, and then trusting your experience and your intuition to solve the rest of the problems. I just think that's a really interesting way to kind of have a forest for the trees scenario where you're able to say, okay, the characterization is going to happen if I understand the structure of a novel. Like, and clearly that structure, if we're going to stick with that word, is working when people keep coming to you, no matter what the genre is, because you can solve that problem.
Yeah, yeah, and I've had some very productive relationships with authors in that way, not making corrections necessarily to their work, though recording an audiobook is probably the most meticulous form of proofing that you can go through. At Dove, we did Amy Tan's books, all of them, and she would come in and record the audiobook herself. And these were unabridged. We did the unabridged and then abridged it later. If that needed to happen. But she would come in with her little dog, who remained quiet all the way through, right? A very cute little dog. She would use the audiobook recording as her final proofing of her manuscript. There was always sufficient time before the publication date that she could make the corrections that were needed.
You just gave me the perfect segue, by the way, to my next question, which is awesome. But something about a dog being in the recording booth is now a fascinating visual I have. I'm curious about this too, because I think about you not only as, like director, but you're also kind of like, I don't know, like the friendly uncle of the audiobook world, in the sense that like you do a lot of coaching for people that might not be narrative or like native audiobook narrators. A lot of times, and this is me speaking, this is not me speaking for Stefan, but in the world of audiobook narration, oftentimes you'll be really excited as a customer to say, ooh, this celebrity is reading the audiobook, and then you start to listen to the audiobook and you say, ooh, I really wish somebody else who knew how to read audiobooks was reading this audiobook, because there's, like any other performing, voice acting, for cartoons, like audio narration for audiobooks, being able to cry on cue for a romantic comedy. These are all different subsects of acting that some people have or do not have. And, before the recording, we were talking about, you guys working with Anne Hathaway to record The Wizard of Oz and things like that. When you, or Amy Tan coming in to read her own books, when you get somebody who is not, natively trained in audiobook narration to ease in and appreciate the format and get the best product you're going to be able to get out of their performance, how do you sort of direct them through that process to make sure that you're getting an audio narration as opposed to a celebrity reading an audiobook?
That's one of the advantages of having gone into this business initially as a director, because I start with that perspective when I'm working with a narrator or actor or whoever it is. Also, the fact that Dove Audio was very celebrity driven means that I had to deal with this on a day-to-day basis. And there were cases, and we've had them as recently as in our own studio, where a very well-known actor, whose name shall remain nameless, has been hired to read a classic, and he comes in and he gets half an hour in, and he says, I can't do this. He's a film actor. He's not used to long form anything. He does a scene, he steps out, he does the same scene again a couple more times, and he's done. Then he moves on to the next scene. This is different, and it demands a different kind of concentration. It demands a different kind of technique, both vocally and psychologically, psychically, if you will. It takes an overview of a kind that some actors just can't deal with. Most good actors can, if you give them some pointers. If you know enough about them or find out enough about them, again, as I was saying about the authors, what languages do they speak? So what kind of languages does this actor speak? And how can we access this material through those languages? And then you've got a working relationship. And that's why we have several celebrity narrators who come and record with us, with one of us directing, because they know they're going to get that kind of attention, that kind of overview, and a particularly fine attention to detail.
Awesome. Well, I wanna be mindful of your time because you're so gracious. We talked a little bit earlier, and we kind of alluded to changes in technology as things have sort of shifted around. And you talked about the fact that, like, you guys were able to do sort of almost full cast productions where you can have people in different time zones and sort of manipulate things. Just in regards to, I guess maybe this is just a question about how you run your studio, but feel free and take it in whatever direction you're most comfortable. But in the sort of changes of technology, like, are there evolutions within the audio recording space that have been total game changers for you in a good way over the last several years, the last decade, or things that have just really made your recording life easier so you can focus on other parts of the process?
Well, the digital process is ultimately, once you grab hold of it and understand how it operates, is a lot easier than recording to CD or DAT or back in the days of reel-to-reel tape, where you'd rock and roll. You'd go back to a cue and re-record over it, all of that stuff. That precedes my time, by the way. No, it's once you understand how it functions, and you have decent enough equipment, and it doesn't have to be expensive, it just needs to be good. And because we operate with a full team, we operate with an editorial team who also proofs the stuff. And the team happens to be in the UK, where I'll probably get shot down for this, but in many respects, technically, electronically, they're a little more advanced than we are in this country. They're fantastic in getting stuff together.
There's a reason we're still fascinated with Abbey Road Studios, right? Like,
Yeah, right, exactly. Just the fact that we're able to do the kind of production that we were talking about, where people are in 3 or 5 different time zones, and make it work and make it sound viable, make it be viable. That's great. That opens up whole new territories.
I do want to just reiterate just the comment you just said about editing, because I think it's really important that and I'm coming at this from sort of a novice who's done a fair amount of research, but I'm obviously not in the audio space as often as you are. But there seems to be a shift in the way in which some publishers are doing audiobooks, where it's kind of a hired gun mentality, where you've got people who are they've got little studios in their apartments in Brooklyn or South Korea or wherever they're living, and they record, they edit, and they send it out, and then the publisher gets it and says, "All right, that's good enough," and sends it off. But one of the themes that's come up in this conversation that I wasn't quite expecting, that I'm really excited about, is the idea that mechanisms and systems seem to be the aspects that make it so your creative work really flourishes and stands above the rest. And I don't think it's maybe it's a little in the shadows when we refer to the idea of, like, oh, my editorial team is in the UK, and they're better with technology, but that's also a system where you're guaranteeing yourself an additional level of quality assurance that other audio production facilities just plain don't have or don't feel as valuable. And I really want to applaud you for being that thorough in the way in which you guys go through these procedures, because at the end of the day, like, you're not just selling a 3 or 5, a 20-hour audio experience. You're selling a story that is hopefully going to remain in the mind of the person for the rest of their lives. And I've always just found, with the things that you produced, like going through all the research of this, I'm sorry, Harlan Ellison is the theme of the day, but, like, in his audio productions, I was unaware that you were the one who had produced and helped to direct a number of his audio, his like self-distributed audio productions. And those are some of the most commonly distributed works that I tell other people to search out. And I think that can only exist when your systems and your mechanisms and your quality assurance is working properly. So I just want to applaud you for that, because that's a huge aspect of the business that obviously costs money, but makes your product just light years ahead of everybody else.
Well, thank you for that. That's an acknowledgement that I'm very grateful for. Yeah.
Well, cool. Well, just to wrap this up, Stefan, you are actively creating all the time, and there were a couple projects that it seems like you got coming down the pike. You wrote a book of poetry called A Valentine, that is going to be available on CD and digitally through Blackstone, if I understand correctly.
Yeah, it's actually been available in that form for the last decade, and we get a nice bump right around Valentine's Day, and that's sweet. Um, there you have it. But there are some amazing narrators involved in that one. Roscoe Lee Brown, Gabrielle Byrne, Samantha Eggar, Robert Foxworth, Amy Irving, Joel Gray, Elliot Gould, Vanessa Redgrave, Burt Reynolds, Gene Smart, Meryl Streep, Alfre Woodard, Michael York, Sharon Stone. That's just part of the cast.
I think that Meryl Streep might be going somewhere from A Valentine to who knows where, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
And then
yeah.
additionally, we're gonna use the word tease. You're teasing a potential crowdfunding project, and do you want to talk about that a little
Yeah.
bit?
Yeah, briefly, and I'd love some responses if there are people who feel that this is something important and who can get on board to help make this happen. A long time ago, when I was teaching at Long Island University, I put together a production. It was a kind of a cabaret show based on Leonard Cohen's music and poetry. He actually came out to see it, and that was my first time meeting him. I'd already been a fan for a long time, and I still am. Fast forward to a few years ago, a writer named Michael Posner, Canadian, of course, as was Cohen, has put together a three-volume series called Untold Stories, which is a lot of interviews by people who had met and knew Cohen. I'm represented briefly in volume two, but there are a lot of other people through there, literally hundreds. I feel these books and Cohen's music, because the idea would be to license a couple of pieces for each of the volumes. They deserve a fuller understanding and a closer look. And there's no better way than to get at the person than through all these different points of view of people who worked with him, respected him, knew him and his music. And so I want to do a full audiobook presentation of these three volumes. They're long. They're I don't know. I think they range between like 16 and 20 hours each. That's a chunk. And I want to do it multicast, including some of the people who are represented in the interviews, whom I've also worked with since. And I think it's an important project, but obviously it's going to be costly. That's something I'd like to do. The author is certainly behind it. The original publisher of the books is kind of was not so interested. So that's basically it. And any kind of feedback from the world at large would be very useful in making a decision, and not just whether to do it or not, but a strategy to take that can get more people interested.
So if we have somebody listening right now who is a Leonard Cohen fan or a extensive audiobook fan with either a ginormous bank account or is a phenomenal, fiscal strategist, or just wants to sort of lend their support for this type of project and help with the hype machine, what are the best ways to find you?
I can be found on Blue Sky or Twitter, and that's at Stefan's Echo is my handle. I can be found on Facebook. I can also be found at our website, which is skyboatmedia.com.
Awesome. And all that stuff will be in the show notes. Stefan, I like to always end the show just to sort of make space and see if there's anything that maybe we haven't covered or anything that's on your mind that you want to sort of throw out there. So is there anything that's kind of jangling around in there that we want to throw out?
Well, in your initial sort of outline of how you like to run the show, you asked about what people do when they're offline, as it were. What I do is listen to music. My favorite way of listening to it is throw maybe 30 or 40 CDs into one of these big changers and put it on random play, random shuffle, right? See what pops up. And I do that many evenings of the week for at least an hour, sometimes longer. That keeps me in touch with the musical side, which for me is the performance origin. And it helps me not to forget that everything has music. The entire world has music. And what an incredible inspiration it can be. All genres. I listen to just about everything. I thought that might be a good closing statement.
Well, I think that's great. And we talked about Leonard Cohen, we talked about Joan Baez, we talked about your sort of history in opera and some of the musical stage performances. What does a Stefan Rudnicki playlist look like? If listeners are out there and they want a taste of the types of CDs that you've got on shuffle, what kinds of stuff is popping up?
There's a fair amount of country music. Rodney Crowell, I actually worked with. He recorded a couple of short stories for one of the anthologies I did at Dove. So he was recording from a studio in Nashville, and I like his music. It keeps growing. So he's an example of the kind of music in the countryside. I'm a longtime fan of Crosby, Stills, and Nash and Young together and individually. I occasionally listen to 50s and 60s rock. I listen to a lot of jazz, from the modern jazz quartet to you name it, just about everybody. Occasionally musicals. I've got a huge collection of vinyl, which I obviously can't do on random play. But when I want something very specific, I've got a lot of shows back from the days when I was doing summer stock, where you do a musical a week. I did that in Saratoga Springs once upon a time. That's a bit of an example.
I love it. Well, it sounds like maybe I'll have to put together some sort of Stefan Rudnicki playlist of some kind, and I'll make sure it's how do I say this? It's officially recognized by Skyboat Media before we do anything with it. It'll be great. Well, Stefan, thanks so much for coming on the show. This was a delight.
It's been a pleasure, Ryan. Just a real pleasure, and I thank you for the opportunity.
Stefan, thanks so much for coming on the show to share your story. You're truly a juggernaut of the industry, and as always, I can't wait to see what else is coming down the pike for Steamboat Media and for your performances. For anybody listening at home that might be interested in kind of getting an even deeper understanding of the just sheer volume of work that Stefan has been involved with, I suggest going to Audible, typing in his name, and just seeing anything that's associated with him. As I was putting together publicity materials for the show, I quite literally did not have enough time to go through all of the pages of content. There's so many cool projects that he's done, and I have a feeling that for the next few months, my car rides are going to be full of the voice of Stefan Rudnicki. So, Stefan, again, thank you so much for coming on the show. Listeners, if you're looking for something in the ilk of Stefan Rudnicki, on episode 5 of the Meditations podcast, I had Mark Silk on the show, another voice actor based in the UK. giving a very different perspective on voice acting. He's been featured in Star Wars Episode 1. He's the voice of Johnny Bravo in the UK. And most importantly, he was the voice of Bob the Builder for 10 years in the US. But Mark has a fascinating glimpse into the world of voice acting and also gets very technical about the types of equipment that he uses and things like that. So episode 5 with Mark Silk might be of interest. Equally, episode 32, I speak with Jen Gunnels, who is the fiction editor of Tor Books. So if you're interested in sci-fi, horror, fantasy, this is the person who is finding the books that make their way to publication. So Jen Gunnels, episode 32, might be of interest to you. Moving ahead, on February 26th, episode 42. At 42, the perfect number is happening. And if you're familiar with Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and you're interested in the world of science, it'll be no surprise that for episode 42, we are going science heavy. Aaron Winnick Anthony is going to be on the show. Aaron is a science communicator. What that means is basically if you're a company that does some really baffling and intensive science, you're doing things with polymers or anti-gravity or whatever, you need to hire somebody to make sure that you can effectively communicate those ideas to the world in a fun and engaging manner. And Erin is that person. She's a former NASA employee who founded a company called Steam Power Media. And at Steam Power Media, she is working with a ton of different companies to help them get their ideas out into the world and also, quite frankly, make science appealing and attractive and accessible. So if you're a science goof, if you're somebody who grew up watching Bill Nye the Science Guy, then this episode is for you. Episode 42, February 26th, with Aaron Winnick Anthony. As always, you can find me on social media, The World of Ryan Zlomek on Facebook. You can find at Ryan Zlomek on Instagram and TikTok. And I am now on Blue Sky as well. You can find at Ryan Zlomek on Blue Sky and send me emails, meditations@ryanzlomek.com. So if you want to reach out, you got something to say, you've got all these channels to do it, or you can just sort of keep an eye on my work. But as always, that's enough just ranting from me. Let's move forward. Let's take our audiobook pause into the day. Please make sure you are kind to one another, that you do nice things, and that you make space for conversation because you just might learn something. Have an awesome, magical, wonderful, story-filled day.